Today's podcast is about a disappearance that, at first glance, might seem pretty obvious as to what happened. But once you hear about the information that was discovered after the disappearance, you might just change your mind. This case will definitely take us down the rabbit hole. Let's talk about Kenneth Plaisted. Kenneth Plaisted was born on March 23, 1923, in Duluth, Minnesota, to parents Michael and Alice Plaisted. Sadly, it appears that his mother Alice would die soon after, in the same year. Plaisted joined the Navy and served in World War II. On December 23, 1945, Kenneth would marry Priscilla Precourt, and the couple would go on to have 6 children. Kenneth Plaisted would graduate from law school, and in 1953, he went to work as a law examiner for the Attorney General of Wisconsin. He would resign from that position 3 years later, in March of 1956, so he could become Executive Secretary of the National Board of Fur Farm Organizations in Milwaukee. He would move his family to nearby Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, that same year. In later years, newspaper articles from 1962, he was also referred to as General Counsel of the Fur Farm Organization. Kenneth Plaisted and his family would eventually relocate once again to New Holstein, Wisconsin, which at the time was a town of only about 3,000 people. He would join William Mulhern and Thomas Lucas at the law firm of Mulhern, Lucas, and Plaisted that was located at 1824 Wisconsin Avenue in New Holstein. Unfortunately, William Mulhern would die suddenly in 1961 at the age of 46 in his sleep of a suspected heart attack. The law practice would continue, and the name was eventually changed to Lucas and Plaisted. Eventually, Thomas Lucas would move and start practicing in nearby Appleton, Wisconsin. Kenneth Plaisted would then move his solo practice to 1806 Wisconsin Avenue in New Holstein. Then on November 16, 1971, 48-year-old Kenneth Plaisted and his wife Priscilla would drive the almost 70 miles to Milwaukee for a business trip and then plan to go help their 22-year-old daughter Donna to purchase a car. Plaisted is said to have withdrawn $350 at a bank in New Holstein to go towards that purchase. According to the Sheboygan Press, this is Priscilla Plaisted's account of that day. She said that her and her husband arrived in Milwaukee around 11 a.m. Her husband dropped her off at Gimbel's department store parking lot first, and then told her he'd be back to pick her up around 12:30 or 1, and then they would go back and pick up their daughter, Donna. He then went to an office across the street at the Plankinton building. She said that was the last time that she ever saw her husband. Priscilla waited until 2:15 p.m. and then phoned her daughter Donna, whom they had planned on picking up after the business meeting. Donna said she had last heard from her father at 11:15 a.m. that morning when he phoned her and told her that he was going to take her out to look for a car. After receiving the call from her mother at 2:15, she then went outside to look for her father, assuming he would be arriving at any time. She saw a car that resembled her father's down the street, so she went to have a closer look. She would be concerned at what she would find. It was her father's car, but he wasn't with it. She found his hat in the gutter near the car. The windows had been rolled down, and it looked like the glove compartment had been rifled through, with the contents from it still laying on the seat. Other newspaper accounts would state that the keys to the car were missing as well. Kenneth's car was found on the 900 block of 14th Street, which was only a few blocks away from Donna's apartment at 1339 West State Street, where he was scheduled to go that afternoon. When his car was found abandoned with no sign of Kenneth Plaisted around it, the police were called. There were 20 policemen assigned to this case, and they would search bus and train stations and airports. There would be newspaper articles covering the disappearance. A grocer contacted authorities because he identified Plaisted as a man who asked him to change a $5 bill at his store on the day he went missing. After that sighting was reported in the newspaper, however, a realtor named Gordon Russell came forward and said that he was the man in the grocery store, not Kenneth Plaisted. Authorities said that Russell did resemble Plaisted, so the false sighting was an honest mistake. Despite extensive searches, there were no leads or verified sightings of Kenneth Plaisted. He had simply vanished. Being a prominent and well-respected attorney, Plaisted was involved in a lot of things in addition to his law practice. At the time of his disappearance, he was the Calumet County Court Commissioner, Vice President of the Kiwanis Club, City Attorney for New Holstein, as well as legal counsel for New Holstein and Kiel school districts. He was also the past president of the Calumet County Bar Association. The Reporter newspaper, in an article from November of 1971, would even state that Plaisted was the only practicing attorney in New Holstein at the time. Priscilla Plaisted and her children were heartbroken at the absence of their loved ones and could not fathom that he had left them willingly. They struggled to understand what had happened, but were certain that foul play had been involved. Her husband's abrupt disappearance really threw the family into a financial tailspin as well, so Priscilla had to do whatever was necessary to support herself and her children who were still at home. She would move with her younger children to Whitefish Bay in March 1972 and begin a job. There was a detail often mentioned online about an interesting coincidence. Kenneth Plaisted had been the court-appointed attorney for brothers Greg and Dennis Howie, who were accused of a burglary at Wick's Lumber Company on July 18, 1970. The brothers were eventually convicted and set to be sentenced on November 19th, but Greg Howie escaped from the jail on the morning of November 16th, the same day Plaisted disappeared. Some have implied that Greg could have been responsible for the disappearance. Some online accounts say that their sentencing was the same day as the disappearance. It wasn't. It was 3 days later. Greg Howie escaped the same day Plaisted had gone missing. Greg Howie was found alive and well and recaptured in Denver, Colorado on February 12, 1973, almost 3 months after his escape, and brought back to Wisconsin for sentencing. In January of 1972, a few months after the disappearance, Priscilla Plaisted, who didn't really have a choice given the circumstances, would file a complaint against her missing husband that stated he had willfully failed to support his family. Based on that, the judge charged him with abandonment and issued a warrant for his arrest. With Plaisted's whereabouts unknown and his return not imminent, some of his responsibilities had to be assigned to others. One of the important jobs he held was co-trustee of the Hughes estate. In case you aren't familiar with that term, the definition of a trustee is someone who is legally entrusted with managing assets that are in the best interest of the beneficiary of the trust. This trust was set up by the late Irwin Hughes and contained around $300,000. His widow, Mrs. Estelle Hughes, as well as Kenneth Plaisted, were the only two trustees and therefore the only ones with access to the trust. A judge ordered the Citizens Bank of Sheboygan to take over as co-trustee in the absence of Plaisted. Because of this, an audit was ordered during this transition. This was a routine practice when a trustee is replaced. However, no one was prepared for what it would reveal. The audit would surprisingly show that Kenneth Plaisted had written and received 27 checks from the trust over the past 2 years, totaling over $65,000 to his personal and business accounts. In modern-day times, that would be roughly $500,000. The checks from the trust were signed by Plaisted and were made out in various ways, such as to Kenneth Plaisted, Kenneth M. Plaisted, Lucas and Plaisted, Lucas and Plaisted Trust Account, and Kenneth N. Plaisted accounts. A hearing would be held on what was discovered during the audit on January 11, 1972. After the hearing, Judge Clarence Neer found Kenneth Plaisted primarily responsible for the wrongful removal of more than $65,000 for the Irwin Hughes Trust, for which he was a co-trustee. The unlawful removal occurred from early 1969 to November of 1971. On January 14th, a warrant was issued for Kenneth Plaisted on 26 counts of theft. He also still had the warrant outstanding for his arrest on abandonment charges filed earlier in the month. Kenneth Plaisted had a lot of explaining to do. The problem was he was still missing. During the hearing concerning the audit, the judge directed the new co-trustee, the National Bank of Sheboygan, to begin efforts to recover the missing money. While at first thought to be just over $65,000, once the interest was added, as well as the penalty and interest on the late filing of the taxes for the trust, the Hughes estate claim grew to just shy of $80,000. Attorney Lyman Precourt, who was Priscilla Plaisted's brother, was appointed receiver for his missing brother-in-law's properties. The definition of a receivership is a court-appointed official who manages assets to preserve them for creditors. Precourt would tell the court that Plaisted's estate had assets of $45,000, but debts of $110,000. Creditors would have until 5:30 p.m. on April 14, 1971, to file claims against the Plaisted estate. When the claims were filed, the list of whom he owed money to and the amount he owed was staggering. The almost 30 claims were listed in a newspaper article in the Reporter dated 4/15. I will list the most substantial amounts owed. Real estate company Totogeme Corp. For $20,000 for reimbursement for improvements to his office, as well as property taxes and other conditions agreed to on the 5-year lease on the property that Plaisted had signed. The law firm of Burke, Pressington, and Meller had taken over Plaisted's law office in New Holstein and would negotiate with Precourt as far as the lease on the property. The People's State Bank, $27,945. Herman Tim for a guaranteed loan of $20,401. Two of the smaller ones listed were interesting. One claim was from Dora Plaisted, who was Kenneth Plaisted's stepmother, for a $1,500 loan, and R.F. Hirth Studio for $21.84 for a portrait sitting and passport sitting. The claims totaled well over 6 figures. But that wasn't the end of the financial woes for the Plaisted estate. The IRS would soon come knocking. It seems that Kenneth Plaisted was not fond of paying taxes for himself nor the trust he was in charge of. The day before he disappeared, he made a late payment of income taxes due for the trust from June of '68 to June of '69. Other payments were delayed from 2 weeks to 2 years. He did not file tax returns for the trust at all in 1970. Then in October of 1972, the IRS would give their final accounting of what Kenneth Plaisted owed for his personal taxes at $43,114. He would eventually be charged in federal court with 1 count of income tax evasion and 2 counts of failing to file tax returns. The IRS said that in 1969, Plaisted reported that he only made $1,030 with no tax owed when he should have listed income of $31,507 and paid taxes of $9,314. They also said in 1970 and 1971, he failed to file tax returns at all, and his gross income for those 2 years was $142,971. Plaisted's assets were liquidated in an attempt to settle all the claims against his estate, although his assets were significantly less than the claims. The law firm of Burke, Pressington, and Meller would purchase the law practice for $28,500. The Plaisted family home at 2103 Pleasant Avenue in New Holstein would sell for $23,000, and his car was sold for $1,058. That would bring the claims against Kenneth Plaisted's estate up to a whopping $183,872, which would in today's terms be in excess of $1.4 million. A final hearing would be held on all the claims. It would take years to clean up the mess that Plaisted, or perhaps Plaisted's disappearance, had left. Then, in the middle of all the legal proceedings that were still being held to sort things out, it seemed like there was finally a break in the case. Paul Ganshoff, a mink farmer and former client of Kenneth Plaisted, would send a letter to Sheriff Ted Pagel dated March 19, 1973, that included an ad placed in the Tampa Bay Times newspaper in Florida on February 14, 1973, that read, "Accommodations wanted. Congenial, well-educated man, retired. Share home or apartment with same. St. Pete area. References exchanged. Ken Plaisted, care of Danielson, P.O. Box 173, Parcel Post Station, Milton, Connecticut, 06460. This new information would prompt the court to issue a federal fugitive warrant for Kenneth Plaisted and would add the charge of unlawful flight to avoid prosecution to his growing list of charges. The thought being that Plaisted traveled from New Holstein to Milford, Connecticut to avoid arrest. I'm also unsure how Ganshoff came to know about this ad placed in a newspaper states away. It could have a more suspicious reason that we aren't aware of, or it could be as simple as someone who knew Paul Ganshoff and had heard about the missing attorney and lived in that area and alerted him to the ad. After being told about the ad, the police now had a direction in which to search, and they diligently pursued this lead, but Kenneth Plaisted could not be found. Then in May of 1974, a newspaper article listed 8 state lawyers that had lost their law license that year, and a couple of the names were familiar. Kenneth Plaisted and his former partner Thomas Lucas were both on the list. It stated that they abandoned their practice after claims against Plaisted, and they were both suspended for failure to answer complaints. Then in August of 1976, a jury trial would begin where the Hughes Trust was suing the People's State Bank, which was now called the M&I Bank of New Holstein, in an effort to recoup the money from the trust that Kenneth Plaisted had misappropriated. Attorney Robert Lutz would represent the Hughes family. He said that beginning in July of 1968, he started embezzling funds for his own personal use. Plaisted would withdraw funds from the Hughes Trust savings account and transfer them to the Hughes Trust checking account. Then checks for similar amounts were written out to him and deposited at the People's State Bank the same day. This seemed to correspond with every time Plaisted had overdrafts in his personal account, which was often. He made clear to the jury that every single transaction in question did not have Mrs. Hughes' signature, which was required. He argued that since the bank allowed the transfers to happen without the authority of the courts or Mrs. Hughes' signature, that they should have known there was no authority and wrongfully allowed the incident to occur. Attorney Lutz said that the bank was saying everything was overdrafts instead of bouncing the checks. In addition to having an account there, it was also mentioned that Plaisted was actually the lawyer for the bank. Mrs. Hughes testified that she made several attempts to discuss the status of the trust fund with Plaisted, but could get no satisfaction. When she would contact him by phone, he would evade her questions. She also said that she had never given him authority to withdraw funds without 2 signatures, and he never asked for her permission or her signature. There would be an out-of-court settlement reached where the People's State Bank had to pay back just over $62,000 to the trust, and Estelle Hughes would have to pay back $5,000 for being negligent in not monitoring the trust more closely. It's interesting to note that it says the embezzlement occurred from July of 1968 to November 27th of 1971. If that last date is correct, and not just a generalization of when the audit was concluded, that would mean the theft continued until 11 days after Plaisted went missing, which would be very interesting. Then on November 28, 1978, just over 7 years since he was last seen, Kenneth Plaisted was officially declared dead in the Calumet County Court. The judge also directed for the insurance company of the 5 life insurance policies that Plaisted held to be paid to his wife Priscilla. One of the life insurance companies objected to the order, but would eventually be made to pay the policy out during a jury trial. In one newspaper article I found some information that came out during testimony at the hearing for the insurance company that was fighting the payout that I found very interesting, and I had not read anywhere in modern-day accounts of this story. In an Appleton, Wisconsin newspaper dated July 27, 1979, Edward Casper would testify that he had scheduled a meeting with Plaisted on the afternoon that he disappeared to go over the accounting of the Hughes Trust. The meeting had been made after much insistence on Casper's part. He shared 2 letters with the court between him and Plaisted about the trust. In his opinion, he didn't think Plaisted would go missing because of the large shortage in the trust account. He went on to say that he and others had tried to find Plaisted to offer to help him get out of debt and start over, but they could not find him. He believed that Kenneth Plaisted was dead. When I looked up to find out who Edward Casper was, because I was curious what role he may have played in the trust, I found a blurb that he had been sold the Hughes Meter Gas Company in 1965. However, he did testify that no funds from that company were connected with the Hughes Trust since 1968, when Kenneth Plaisted lasted a last complete accounting. 15 years after Plaisted disappeared in 1986, Kenneth Plaisted's son Michael would weigh in on his father's disappearance. He said, "I think there's been a death, and there's been a murder, and there was someone that got away with it." He goes on to say, "The general public knowing about the theft and the disappearance may think we're naive to think he's dead. But we knew him ourselves. When we put all the facts together, we just knew that he wouldn't have simply left us." His daughter Barbara also thinks her father is dead. She said the problem is that soon after he went missing, there were warrants out for his arrest, and they were looking for a fugitive and not a dead man. Kenneth's wife Priscilla Plaisted was also interviewed, and she said, "You could say, okay, the guy just left. You have to look at that. But he couldn't do that to his family. I don't think he could stay away from his children or me that long." There is an interesting theory that has been mentioned on the internet concerning Kenneth Plaisted and what could have happened after his disappearance. If you haven't heard what it is, I think it will surprise you. Some people have speculated that Kenneth Plaisted is actually D.B. Cooper. Yes, you heard that right, the infamous skyjacker. If you aren't familiar with or don't remember the story of D.B. Cooper, here is a brief recap. D.B. Cooper was a still as of yet unidentified man who hijacked a Northwest Orient Airlines flight on November 24, 1971. During the Portland to Seattle flight, he told a flight attendant he had a bomb and demanded $200,000 in ransom and 4 parachutes. After releasing the passengers in Seattle, Cooper then instructed the flight crew to refuel the aircraft and begin a second flight to Mexico City with a refueling stop in Reno, Nevada. About 30 minutes into the second flight, D.B. Cooper opened the aircraft's door, deployed the staircase, and parachuted into the night over southwestern Washington. His identity and whereabouts are still unknown to this day. When people mention this theory, it was due to Plaisted matching the general description of Cooper and the fact that this hijacking occurred just 8 days after Kenneth Plaisted disappeared. However, I don't find much of a resemblance, and Plaisted had gray hair, whereas the composite sketch of Cooper showed his hair being dark. I definitely do not think that Plaisted was the infamous D.B. Cooper, but it is an interesting theory that I wanted to share. Time would go by and no trace of Kenneth Plaisted was ever found. No tips and no sightings. 20 years after the disappearance, there would be an article in the Milwaukee Journal where Michael Plaisted, Kenneth's son, who is also now a lawyer, would share that he has done his own investigating into his father's disappearance. You might be surprised at what he had to say, and it is information that hadn't been mentioned publicly before. Michael Plaisted claims that while his father had taken money from the trust account in order to cover shortages in his own account, an IOU was placed on file with the bank. He said that hardly seemed like the act of a person who was trying to conceal a theft. He also learned that all of the money taken from the trust had been spent before his father disappeared. So they believe Kenneth Plaisted was murdered, but by who? The family can think of one person. They haven't revealed this person's name, but they said there was a former associate with whom their father had a bitter dispute. Plaisted's family said the man was supposedly seen in Milwaukee on the day their father disappeared. After this article, however, there is very little coverage about Kenneth Plaisted's disappearance. His vanishing is as abrupt and as baffling as they come. I did reach out to Michael Plaisted to see if I could ask him a few questions about his father's disappearance. He thanked me for reaching out, but politely declined, saying their recent experience with true crime was not good. As far as my thoughts on this case, where do I start? There is so much to cover. I do want to say that I have no doubt that Kenneth Plaisted loved his family very much. Whatever happened, I'm sure it was not a reflection on them or how he felt about them. I completely understand and respect their views and their opinion that their father would not have abandoned them and that he was murdered. But there is a lot to consider in this case. You can't downplay everything that Kenneth Plaisted did. He stole huge amounts of money and hid it from everyone. There was no mention of any IOUs in any of the 20-plus newspaper articles that I've read from around the time this happened, only in the article with his son that was 20 years later. But even if an IOU was left, he was still hiding what he was doing from the people he was supposed to be looking after the trust for, which is who the money belonged to. If you take something you are not authorized to take, even if you make a mention of it somewhere, it is still theft. He was also not filing personal income taxes when he was supposed to anyway, and some that he did file, he misrepresented his income significantly. He was also not filing taxes for the trust or filing them late. Now I want to talk about Thomas Lucas, Kenneth Plaisted's former law partner. It might surprise you to know that not long after Plaisted, Lucas went missing too. Well, sort of. Lucas, like Plaisted, was a well-respected attorney in New Holstein with a lot of titles. After they dissolved their partnership, Lucas then set up practice in Appleton, Wisconsin. Thomas Lucas got a divorce that was finalized on November 5, 1970, and he was ordered to pay spousal and child support for the couple's 4 children. Apparently he wasn't paying it because on March 7, 1973, the Calumet County Social Services Department issued a felony warrant against Lucas for abandonment as well as spousal support. At the time, he was in arrears of $7,000. He would go missing, however, for the next 3 years, staying under the radar to avoid being arrested. Then a tragedy would happen to the Lucas family. In August of 1976, the 17-year-old son of the attorney, Grant Lucas, would be killed in a car accident. New Holstein police knew there had, at one time anyway, been a warrant for Lucas's arrest, so they decided to stake out the funeral home in case Lucas showed up. The sheriff was outside the funeral home at 6:30 p.m. on August 18, 1976, when Thomas Lucas pulled up. They spoke briefly, and Lucas went inside. The sheriff was surprised that Lucas showed up, so he didn't have the warrant with him. He went to the police station to see if the warrant was still valid, and when he came back to the funeral home to arrest him, Thomas Lucas had slipped out a side door and fled. There was an investigation conducted by the Attorney General's office concerning the sheriff's conduct in letting Thomas Lucas away, but they concluded that no criminal activity had occurred in his failure to detain Lucas. Then finally, on April 24, 1977, 4 years after the warrant for his arrest was issued, Thomas Lucas was apprehended at the Boston airport by customs agents after arriving back in the States from Canada. He apparently had moved to Toronto. He would waive extradition to Wisconsin and was ordered to catch up on the arrears, which by then had risen to over $34,000. I found no mention of him after that. I am curious, though, since his law license had been suspended in Wisconsin, if Thomas Lucas had resumed practicing law in Canada. Okay, so that's the sordid story of Thomas Lucas around the time that Plaisted went missing. As far as Thomas Lucas and his comments on his former partner's theft, he wouldn't say much, but he did say in his trial testimony that he had no knowledge of the trust statement and said the accounting was handled by the John Sutter Agency in Chilton. He said the Hughes Trust and its funds were handled exclusively by Plaisted at People's State Bank. He stated that he stopped coming into the office regularly in 1970 and not at all after Plaisted moved to his own office. So according to Thomas Lucas, he had no idea of anything that was going on. But should we believe him? My answer is no. I don't believe for a minute that there were all these funds being taken from the Hughes Trust and a substantial amount being put into the law firm's joint account, yet Lucas had no idea that anything was amiss. At the very least, if he saw huge amounts of money being deposited and then removed, he should have questioned it, yet in testimony he claims he didn't know anything at all about anything. Also, why would Thomas Lucas let his law license be suspended for something that he wasn't aware that his partner had done? It stated the reason for the suspension was failure to answer complaints. It is unknown to what degree that Thomas Lucas knew about this fraudulent act, or if he was culpable in any way. As I said, Lucas and Plaisted had dissolved their law practice not long before Plaisted went missing. I don't know this to be a fact, and it is just speculation on my part, but I wonder if Thomas Lucas could be the former associate that Kenneth Plaisted had a bitter dispute with that Michael Plaisted talked about. I will address the classified ad. It is simple. It was not the Kenneth Plaisted that we are talking about. I mean, there are an infinite amount of people out there with matching names. I even found an obituary from 1984 for a Kenneth Plaisted. He was just a few years older than the Kenneth Plaisted from New Holstein, and he died in St. Petersburg, Florida, which is very near Tampa where the classified ad was placed, in 1973. Besides, if Kenneth Plaisted was on the run, as if the person in the ad were him would indicate, why would he be stupid enough to post an ad where hundreds of thousands, if not millions, would see it and his name, knowing by now that he was a wanted fugitive? Plus, if he were on the run, he probably had plenty of money with him, so he would not need to share a house or apartment with a stranger. As far as how the former client happened to see the classified ad to send it to police, I just think it was innocent enough that he came across it, but I don't know exactly how he did it. To sum it up, the ad being placed by the missing attorney just isn't logical. Okay, now I want to talk about the reasons that might support Kenneth Plaisted going missing that day, not of his own choice, and meeting with foul play. His departure happened very quickly, going to his meeting and then parking near where his daughter lived, so he was definitely aware of the plans he had made and seemed to be following through with them. After all these years, it still hasn't been revealed what the meeting in Milwaukee was about and who was it with. Also, according to Plaisted's son, he had a dispute with someone who was possibly in the same town on the day he went missing. If he had planned on going on the lam that day, you would think he would have wrapped things up a little better as far as business dealings. For example, we know he had an upcoming court date with the Howey brothers for their sentencing, and probably many more things on his calendar as well. I will say that I don't think that Greg Howey had anything to do with Plaisted's disappearance. He just didn't want to go to jail, so he ran. This was a fairly simple case, so you wouldn't think he had a vendetta against a court-appointed attorney or the skills to pull something like this off. He would have had to escape and get in a car and drive to Milwaukee, where he just happened to catch Plaisted in the middle of his day and knew where his daughter lived and abducted him. So if this was a plan of escape by the attorney, you could also say that he wouldn't have involved his wife and daughter that day in his plans. Also, I have no doubt that Kenneth Plaisted was very devoted to his family, and if he purposely left them the way he did, it was pretty heartless. I mean, he drops his wife off to go shopping and just leaves her there and never comes back. He phones his daughter to let her know he'll be there in a few hours to pick her up, but parks his car nearby and just walks away and never returns. That sounds like a convincing argument for Kenneth Plaisted to have met with foul play. But let's talk about the reasons Kenneth Plaisted would have left on purpose, and the list is pretty long. First off, he was stealing money. He was not paying taxes. It also seemed that his activity regarding the trust was possibly close to coming out. Probably the biggest one thing that I keep coming back to is that Kenneth Plaisted, seemingly reluctantly, makes an appointment to go discuss the trust. The same trust he is taking money from and not paying taxes on. He then plans a day full of errands and makes an appointment in a town over an hour away, close to the same time, and doesn't show up to the trust appointment. I have a hard time believing that was an honest mistake. Also, according to an article who quoted his daughter, she said that her father called her that morning to tell her that he was going to take her to look for a car. The way it was worded, it made me wonder if it was a last-minute trip and something that hadn't been planned in advance. If it was last minute, that might bolster the theory that he needed an excuse that day to not make the appointment in New Holstein. I wish we knew more information about the appointment that Plaisted apparently did show up to in Milwaukee that day. Who was it with? Was that person interviewed? If Plaisted did go missing on purpose, what happened during that appointment? Did something happen during that meeting that caused Plaisted to make a split decision to flee? Or did something happen to Plaisted at the appointment? Remember, at first it was said that the last supposed sighting of him was at a grocery store, but that turned out to be a realtor who resembled him. So when was the actual last sighting of Kenneth Plaisted? I'm also curious about where the car was parked. It may point more to the theory of him meeting with foul play if he parked the car there as he was supposed to pick her up. Or was it someone who knew the family and knew of Plaisted's plans, so decided to park his car there to help hide the crime? Also, if Kenneth Plaisted were abducted, where did it happen? His glove box had been rifled through, and his hat was on the ground near the car. Were those signs of him being taken forcibly? The problem with that theory is that no one seemed to see any signs of struggle or duress, and that was a street in the middle of a busy town on a weekday afternoon. Meaning if Plaisted had been forcibly abducted at his car, you would think someone would have seen something, especially when the newspaper reported he was missing and where his car was found. If Kenneth Plaisted did go on the run, why hasn't he been found after all this time? I did notice that one of Plaisted's claims was from a photography business, and it was for portrait and passport photos. Was it just a routine update, or was there a reason he needed to update his passport? The statute of limitations ran out a long time ago on these crimes. An FBI agent said there is no reason to believe that Plaisted left the country, but admitted that it was easy to obtain a passport back then and hard to determine if one was issued. He went on to say that Plaisted was a world traveler and it would be easy to leave the country undetected. After that, it would be a simple matter of dropping out of sight. Probably the biggest question I have that we do not know is, why did Kenneth Plaisted need all this money? According to the IRS, he made just shy of $140,000 in a 2-year span, so approximately $70,000 a year before taxes in 1971, so that was very good money. Yet he still needed more. It came out in the court proceedings that he was overdrawn constantly. The Reporter newspaper from 11/13 of 71 stated in an article about the council meeting that Kenneth Plaisted was unable to attend and had been called to Minnesota due to his mother's illness. As I mentioned, his birth mother died shortly after his birth, but his father did get remarried to Dora Gotham in 1927. I assume the mother that was referenced was her. I only bring this up because this trip was just a few days before his disappearance. I have no doubt he traveled there to be with his mother, but I can't help but wonder, considering he would go missing less than a week later, if he did anything else on that trip. His son stated in the article that when his father went missing, the money had already been spent. What does that mean? Does that mean the money wasn't in his personal account? If so, he could have moved it to another account that no one was aware of. Also, how did the son know this? Perhaps when his mother checked the account when he went missing, some of the items that the creditors listed were just everyday things, and with the income that the IRS says that he made, it doesn't make sense why there was such a deficit. There has to be much more to this disappearance than we know. Another reason that Kenneth Plaisted could have chosen to leave his life and family is out of shame. If he was concerned that his questionable activity regarding the trust was going to be found out, he knew what that would mean. Possible jail time and revocation of his license to practice law. Also having to pay back all of the money with fines added on top of that. He was a very well-established lawyer in New Holstein, and his reputation would take a huge hit if that were to come out. Maybe he wanted to shield his family from the shame and thought if he left or went missing, all the secret financial activity he'd been doing the past 2 years would not be found out. Perhaps he planned on leaving and then coming back when the smoke had cleared, but something or someone had prevented him from doing so. Also, a theory that I have thought about is, did Kenneth Plaisted plan his disappearance to look like an abduction? If he did, it was a masterful job. He was known to have a substantial amount of cash with him. Him leaving his wife stranded at the department store, his glove box being gone through, his hat being found on the ground nearby, and him leaving the car near Donna's apartment would all seem to point to a typical abduction scenario. But what if Kenneth planned those things so his family would assume he had been abducted rather than them learning what he had been doing and having to face them? I've said a lot of things about Plaisted leaving willingly, so you might be surprised to know that I'm actually 50-50 on whether Kenneth Plaisted disappeared willingly or met with foul play that day. I first think about his wife and his 6 children, whom he no doubt loved and were dependent on him. It is hard to think that he would just leave them so abruptly and plan on never seeing them again. He would have to know the pain it would cause them. So that makes me think he met with foul play. But then I remember the meeting he had scheduled the very same day he went missing, where he would have to answer questions about the trust, and that weighs heavily. So to sum it up, I really think this could go either way. I really admire the Plaisted family and how they have stayed strong in the belief that their father's absence in their life was not by choice. Kenneth Plaisted was a highly regarded father, with some people describing him as well-liked and having perfect character. Priscilla Plaisted remarried in 1982 and died in 2015 at the age of 90. Kenneth Plaisted's daughter, Barbara Plaisted, passed away in 2023 at the age of 75. Kenneth Plaisted is remembered fondly by his remaining children. On a past interview regarding her husband, Priscilla Plaisted's words were poignant yet simple. He loved us too much to put us through this. There are so many unknowns and questions we probably won't know the answer to about this disappearance, but hopefully his remains can be found and his family can get the answers in this failure to appear. That concludes my podcast on Kenneth Plaisted. If you enjoyed it, please leave me a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find me on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and iHeartRadio under one word, Lost and Found Podcast. You can also read all of my articles, as well as links to my most recent podcasts, on my website at Lost and Found Blogs. I have social media pages under my blog name on Facebook, X, and Instagram. You can reach me via email at lostandfoundpodcast@yahoo. I also have a donate button on the bottom of my blog's main page, as well as a Patreon channel with exclusive content on some lesser-known missing persons cases. And remember that cold cases stay cold because their story stops getting told.